Using Zen Tool to establish your project skeleton. Got a couple of housekeeping items. One is there are a lot of slides to this presentation. We shouldn't have a problem getting through it. I've been through this a few times with the timing, etc. We should be okay. But if you feel I'm going a little bit fast, feel free to go, hey, slow down, that type of thing. Especially if I get all excited, I'm sure I'll blow through a few of them. You're like, what the heck? If you haven't noticed, I wear braces, which is not normally a big deal, except for on Thursday I got an adjustment. My cheeks are all kinds of torn up, so if I sound like my words are all kinds of jumbled or I'm making funny faces after an hour of speaking, it's because of my braces. Nothing personal. I'm not, making fun of you or anything along those lines. Just letting you know. And one other little housekeeping note is that my normal laptop that I have died a sudden, horrible death in the middle of my creation of this presentation several weeks ago. So I switched over to an old tower machine I had, bought a MacBook Pro, didn't have time to learn a Mac environment on top of putting together the presentation. So I developed the presentation and the software on an XP tower, and I'm presenting it on a Vista laptop. Windows is not my normal environment. So if you find me typing Linux commands and then scratching my head while the command prompt's laughing at me, give me a second or feel free to shout it out. It's a little bit of a conversion because I don't normally use Windows. So just putting that out there right now. Okay, so Jeremy Brown, that's me, Zen Certified Engineer since I think 2005. I've been using PHP since 1999, right when PHP 3 came out, right on the cusp of 2 kind of getting phased out and 3 coming in. So I have been using it for quite a while now. Almost exclusively. Started with Perl, did some ASP, who didn't back in the day, whatever you can bring the money in during the .com days, etc. Still write some Perl, use some Cold Fusion, everybody's favorite, etc., etc. But over time, PHP's become my predominant language. Not that I don't dabble in other stuff to stay current, but I've made my living for the last decade off of PHP. I've been using Zen Framework since 2008, right around version 1.04, which is like the first major stable-ish version of Zen Framework after a bunch of what historically you'd almost consider alpha releases. Not that there haven't been some issues between 104 to the current 110, which we'll get into. Presently, I'm a software architect and team lead at Spear One, which is a corporate event management / registration company, as well as a rebate redemption implementation for companies doing corporate rebates amongst their sales team, business-to-business type of stuff. And we use Zen Framework exclusively for all of our applications. Although, like most places, we have a few legacy apps running around still, but everybody just kind of relegates to the corner. Okay, my contact information, and this will be again up at the end. I have a blog, notmessenger.com. You can find me on Twitter. There's my email address. A lot of times you can find me in the ZF Talk and the Dallas PHP rooms on IRC. I'm also in several others, but you can almost always find me in there. My screen name, I should have put, if you couldn't guess, is Not Messenger. So that's how you can find me. This presentation is also on my blog. So if you go to notmessenger.com, you can click on presentations, or if you go to that URL, you can view the entire slide deck. There's also code examples, because we're going to have some live code along as we go through this presentation. All the code examples are already up there in package for you to download and play with as well. I'm also recording this for my own uses, but I'm also going to put a copy of it on my website as well. So once I figure out how to do the video encoding on a Mac, I will put it up there. If I'm buying a Mac, it's everything Mac. I'm just jumping in both feet. I have lots of friends that use it, so it shouldn't be too hard, or I'll be buying a lot of pizza and beer. And the slides are also, this is the direct URL to the slides on SlideShare, but you can also get to them through my blog, so anyway. Okay, and one last piece of the housekeeping as far as I'm concerned. You'll notice I have this URL down here at the bottom, or up here. I would greatly appreciate, but you're under no obligation whatsoever, that at the end of the presentation, if you can find a few minutes in your day, tonight or tomorrow, or whenever you happen to think about it, if you'd be so kind as to go to this site, leave any feedback, comments. It's great for me as a presenter to learn things I can tweak about the specific presentation, things in general. Feel free if you want to leave some comments about the organization as a whole. I'm sure Tish would certainly be interested, although primarily this is geared more towards this physical presentation. So again, if you'd be so kind, greatly appreciate it. Okay, so now it's all about you. How many of you heard of Zen Framework before? Or perhaps who hasn't heard of Zen Framework before? All right, so we have 1 and 2. Okay, this will help give me a feel for some of the coming up slides, like how we're going to tailor some of this. How many of you played with Zen Framework a little bit? And that's as far as you want to continue going, right? Okay. How many of you actually use it in a project on a regular basis? You don't count. We work together. We're exclusively Zen Framework. Okay, so that gives me an idea. So we're going to spend a few minutes going into Zen Framework itself. So while it's not the core focus of this presentation is about Zen Tool, which allows you to get an application up and running quickly inside of Zen Framework. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to quickly get started with something you don't necessarily have an understanding or an exposure to begin with. So we'll talk a little bit about what Zen Framework is. So that's part of the laying the groundwork section. All right, what is Zen Framework? Open source object-oriented web application framework implemented in PHP 5. All of the components are full object-oriented PHP 5, and they're E-strict compliant. Use-at-will architecture of loosely coupled components and minimal interdependencies. So you're going to hear a lot of talk when you hear about Zen Framework about MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. And it's a separation of programming concerns. You have a model which represents your data or your business logic. You have a view which represents how you're presenting the data to your endpoint, be it a browser or however else you want to view it, maybe JSON or RSS feed, etc. And then you have a controller which acts as basically a traffic controller or glue, you'll hear either analogy, to say, okay, what are you asking for? Where do I go get it from the model? How do I present it through the view? That's MVC. So a lot of times you're going to see Zen Framework installed in the MVC architecture, where it takes absolute control over everything and it acts as an entire application. But the cool thing about Zen Framework is it's a use-at-will architecture, loosely coupled components. If you have an existing application written in PHP, object-oriented or not, it does not matter, and you're like, you know what, I need to send a HTML email or a MIME-encoded email or an email with attachments, you can go download Zen Framework and just load the Zen Mail component and use all of the capabilities of Zen Mail without having to have the MVC architecture sitting on top of your application. You can pull a lot of the components in and use them at will. So you have 2 ways to use the Zen Framework. And it's a great way to get your feet wet with it, because you can start playing with some of the components, and then as you start using more and more of them, you're like, oh, well, now I need this one to talk that way and this way, and then you suddenly realize, well, if I just convert this to an MVC, it's already got this overarching view of things, and I can share data between the components, dependency injection, and all kinds of fun stuff and the buzzwords that you hear. So that's something that's really cool about the framework. Why use a framework? Whether it be Zen Framework or any other framework, most of their stated goals is to provide components for common requirements in web application development. If in every single project you need to manage cookies or session or user login or database handling or error handling or any of those types of things, you probably have your own library. No matter what language you're writing in or what program you're writing to create, you all have your own library that handles certain tasks. And that's no different than what this is. This is saying if you're going to develop a web application, there are certain things you need to do over and over and over again. So out of the box, the framework provides a lot of those answers for you, fully customizable. Okay, so how do you learn about Zen Framework? They have a manual online. I would like to point out that you will find that the manual acts more like a manual than it does a tutorial. So if you're hoping to go to the manual and read about a component and go, oh, now I can use that, depending on the component, you're not going to be as thrilled as you were hoping to be. Zen Mail, you can go read it from top to bottom. It will make perfect sense. You drop it in. It will work exactly like the manual said. Zen Tool, not so much. Zen Form, you better go do some other reading and read some blogs and some other stuff to help make some heads or tails out of it. That is one of the downsides of Zen Framework. The Zen Framework team is aware of that. They're working to make it better. Version 1.10 was just released on Wednesday, and with that came a versioned manual. A lot of times you'd be reading something in a manual, and there'd be the next version's instructions or variables in the code, but it wasn't in the current code base, and it just got really convoluted. With 1.10 release on Wednesday, if you go to the Zen Framework website now, you can pick the version of the manual you want to read, and it'll tie into the version of the code that you downloaded. So that is a big step towards where they want to head. And there's a big push towards coming up with more tutorials and a tutorial-based add into it, and that kind of stuff. So it'll get better. And there's a part at the end we'll talk about how you can help make it better, etc. Okay. So what then is Zen Tool? It is both a rapid application development tools as well as a framework for exposing your own set of tooling needs to the Zen Tool user interface. So, no, really. What's Zen Tool? Because that makes no sense. That is right out of the manual. And you read that and you go, great, marketing fluff. How? I don't get it. All right, so Zen Framework. This is your basic structure of the Zen Framework application. This is without any modules, and I'll talk about that in a second, and this is with modules. So you're going to see they're very, very, very similar. So Zen Framework application has a standardized structure that they try to promote. The Zen tool is going to generate this structure for you. We'll get into this a little bit for the people that aren't familiar with Zen Framework. We'll walk through this and explain it real quickly. But you see this, and you instantly go, oh boy, if I got to create site after site after site, Zen Tool helps you create site after site after site, and other things as well. And that's what we're going to go over this evening. So you have an application folder. You have a public folder. You have tests, you could have data, you could have a bunch of other stuff too. It's not really important for what we're going for this evening. But the main part is public. All your requests, this is an MVC architecture. All of your requests through Apache are going to be routed to your index.php via the htaccess file. This is going to run your, where did I put it? It's going to run your bootstrap file, which is going to build up all the resources and start loading everything you need to do. And then depending on the page you were asked, you're going to end up in your controllers, which say this is what we want to do. It's going to go talk to models, which I didn't load any in here as an example, to get data. And it's going to use view scripts to spit out that information in whatever format you want. This is the same type of structure. Zen Framework has this concept of modules. Initially, it was the idea where you go, oh, well, if I need an admin section of my website, I'm just going to create an admin module, and that way I kind of have separation of concerns, and it's easier to have a different layout. Your layout is your overall template that you want to apply to every page in the site, and then each page has their own template that you can customize the page level. To eventually now where modules is leaning more towards and heading toward the direction of you should be able to write a self-contained standalone Zen Framework application and distribute it and drop it into another Zen Framework application, and they should be able to load themselves. So I should be able to write a really cool blog application in Zen Framework, give it to you. You should be able to drop the blog application I wrote into your modules folder. It has its own bootstrapping, and now suddenly your site has installed a blog application. Does it all work how it should? Not quite yet. But that's where they're heading with Zen Framework. Which again goes back to, you go to the manual, you read it, you get all excited, you try it, and then you beat your head against the table. Because things don't quite work. So again, they're improving the documentation, and things are progressing quite rapidly in the community.
Do both of those columns represent 1.10?
They actually represent 1.8-ish forward. But yeah, I mean, so definitely 1.10. 1.8 introduced Zend application. And Zend application was the idea. Here's what happened. Back in 1.04, when I was, started off with Zen Framework, you start writing applications, and you come to realize very quickly, I need to do the same things on every single controller request. I need to set my language. I need to set my time zone. I need to set my title of my website. I need to do all these things. So you end up writing, at the time, you started writing front controller plugins. And you would say, before, and this is getting much deeper into Zen Framework, but before I actually go and route to the controller, I know what I need, but before I get there, I'm going to do this other stuff to set up my application. I'm going to load my database connector. I'm going to read my config files in. I'm going to get my translation. So it was a lot of homegrown systems that eventually culminated into an actual component inside of Zen called Zend application, where it's now standardized the way that you bootstrap an application. So conceptually, it's not much different than when everybody was homegrown, but now it's an actual officially supported module within Zen, or a Zen Framework rather. And this is the structure for it, where your modules, which in this case there is no module. The default module doesn't have to exist because it's the default. So this is a module. In this particular case, you have a default module and a blog module, both of which, you have bootstrapping. Your default doesn't have to because it doesn't need it. It knows what to do because it's the default. But every other module would have its own bootstrap, so you can. There's no sense in loading a resource for this module if you're not routing a request to go there. If you're not asking to go to the blog application, then why load the resources the blog needed? Whereas in the thing I just talked about a moment ago, where you're doing front controller plugins, you are loading it all the time, or you have to do a big giant case statement saying, well, if you're asking for this one, load these resources, etc. So it just tied it all together much more nicely. Okay, so Zen Tool. There are two main classes in Zen Tool. You have Zen Tool Framework, which is the component responsible for dispatching the tooling requests, and you have Zen Tool Project, which is the component responsible for exposing the project-specific tooling capabilities.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I'm sorry. Can you give an example of a tooling request?
The tooling request is going to be prompting the user for input.
Okay.
And we'll definitely get it. We have examples of all that stuff, but yep, that's exactly right. So those are the two main classes. And then there's these two supporting classes, or the gravy if you want. You have Zen Code Generator and Zen Reflection. And these are separate components inside of the Zen Framework. It's completely separate from this conversation. If you want to use Zen Code Generator in a project and use the capabilities it has, you absolutely can. Zen Tool just makes use of these. They were created as a need for Zen Tool, but they're designed to be completely standalone. This allows you to manipulate files and directories and a bunch of other stuff, and this lets you read in classes and members and et cetera, so you can reflect on the code. This is an extension to the built-in PHP reflection classes, plus some extra stuff that's specific to Zen Framework. So, let's start talking about all these pieces. This stuff is going to get rather wordy. Your eyes are going to start to gloss over, trust me. You can go back and read these slides again later. When we get to the examples, it'll start tying back in and making sense. I really didn't want to put all this in here, but the code by itself didn't really make a whole lot of sense, but this is kind of boring, so I'm sorry. All right. Zen Tool Framework. And I'm just going to read through these quickly. Dispatch style framework designed to abstract enough system internals to make extensibility easy. The key phrase to remember about the Zen Tool Framework is this one. Flexibility of the tooling dispatch over speed of the tooling dispatch. When we get into the code examples tonight, and when you start using it at home on your own or office or wherever, you're going to type a command, take a couple sips of coffee, it'll get to it. Because they chose flexibility over speed. Now, there are talks. Ralph Schindler is the individual who wrote Zen Tool. He lives in Austin. He works for Zen. They're aware of this. They're going to try to do some things to speed it up. But Zen Tool right now is in enough flux that they're more concerned about functionality, getting many people using it as possible so they can identify the things that need improvement. They want a wide adoption, and then they'll start fixing things. So that's kind of the focus. As I mentioned before, version 1.10 came out on Wednesday. 1.9 of Zen Tool was pretty decent, and this presentation is mainly based off of it. And we get a little bit into 110, but I did not have time to thoroughly vet all the changes in 110 between Wednesday and today. We're going to touch on it a little bit. I can tell you some of the things that got better. The things I'm teaching you here shouldn't change, that type of thing. So it's not like, oh great, I'm watching a 1.9 presentation, I'm going to go read the 110 manual and I'm lost again. You'll be fine. But 110 improved a lot of stuff over 1.9. So if you were really trying to use 1.9 to its fullest capabilities, you were really irritated. 110 should remove a lot of that irritation. Not saying it's not going to introduce its own, but 110 is definitely an improvement over 1.9's version of Zen Tool. Okay, so Zen Tool Framework is broken down into client storage and configuration, loader, provider, and provider repository, manifest repository, metadata, and system built-in providers. We're going to go through each of these real quickly, although this one we're not going to because the actual examples we get into are going to touch on them, so I'm not going to bore you with the information twice. These are just more of a set you up so that when we see it in the code, you're like, oh, that's that piece, and how it all ties together. Okay. So, the Zen Tool Framework client. its responsibilities: the request object, response object, interactivity support, setting up the system registry, containing all the required objects, and the actual dispatching. First implementation of the Zen Tool Framework client is Zen Tool Framework Client Console. So right now, Zen Tool only has a command line interface to it. There are plans to build a web interface, and you could build any interface to it. You could build Twitter. You could have Zen Tool Framework Client Twitter. It will extend the Zen Tool Framework Client, and it will facilitate the request and the response, and interactivity, the dispatching of the actual calls, etc. So that is the responsibility of the Zen Tool Framework Client. All right, client storage and client config. Allows clients to specify configuration values for the system and the providers to use. It also allows clients to store artifacts on the file system that the system and the providers can consume, such as custom profile files and provider-specific file formats and metadata. There go the eyes. All right, in a nutshell, the idea is if you eventually want to be able to use Zen Tool to create rapidly an application, a Zen Framework application, or other things that we haven't talked about yet that you can do with Zen Tool. It doesn't do you any good if you don't have a way to store your own settings and your own configuration files and be able to change the default way Zen Tool does stuff out of the box and all that kind of thing. So Zen Tool Framework Client Storage and Client Config are simply the classes that facilitate the management of those types of capabilities. As simple as that. I say with a smile. All right, Zen Tool Framework Loader. Care to guess what it does? It's going to load files. We're going to get into writing our own providers and our own manifests, and I'll explain what those are later, so again, don't worry. But upon doing so, it's the Zen Tool Framework Loader that's going to go and look for and load those files. That way they're available as resources inside of your project. So again, pretty straightforward. All right, the Zen Tool Framework Provider and Provider Registry. So, it's an interface for defining via a class dispatchable actions and specialties. It also is a registry to maintain instances of all providers available, and the parsing of provider classes for dispatchable signatures. So, this says, I have Zen Tool, and I have a way to store my own user configuration stuff, and I have a way to load my own providers, and I have a console client available to me, but the actual stuff that does the work inside of Zen Tool is a Zen Tool Framework Provider. And so this is the object and the classes that are going to do all the work. They're going to expose capabilities. They're also going to keep track of information from provider to provider and be able to call out to the request object or write things out to the response object, etc. Again, we're going to get into all of that. But this is the workhorse of Zen Tool. All the other stuff has to be there, but this is what gets the work done. Because without a provider, you're not going to be providing anything. So, okay. And then lastly, Zen Tool Framework Manifest and Manifest Repository. So the manifest can supply a collection of providers, actions, and/or metadata, and the registry provides a way to search for metadata in the manifest. Again, we're going to have examples for this, I promise. If you think back to, or maybe even current day shipping, if you have a manifest, it's nothing more than a list that says, hey, this is there, and this should go over there, and that type of thing. This is a way to be able to manage your providers. And we're going to get into that more. It's also a way to provide information, additional information about those providers, context in which they should be used, or different actions, different ways they should act, depending on the context in which they're being used. And then they also expose the ability to get to the registry to search for the metadata that's attached to your providers and that type of thing. So, very powerful. Zen Tool Framework Metadata, its primary use case is to attach data about data. Basically, it just says, hey, this is the object or the class that's going to be used to manage my metadata when I'm accessing it through my manifest. So, for example, if you wanted to use short names, so you can give a provider a name, and there's a system default way of the name it's going to have, but then you can override that and give it a shorter name by giving it metadata, which is managed through your Zen Framework the Zen Tool Framework metadata, which is going to be exposed to your Zen Tool Framework manifest. So, questions? It will get clearer, I promise. And a lot of that was verbatim right out of the manual, because I tried as I might. I'm not a big fan of just grabbing stuff out of the manual and throwing it up here, because anybody can go read the manual. Try as I might to explain it differently, you got the manual, because there just really wasn't any other way to do it. All right, so that was Zen Tool Framework. If you remember back to that first slide many minutes ago, where we had Zen Tool Framework and Zen Tool Project, and those are the two main classes of Zen Tool. So we just got done talking about Zen Tool Framework. This is Zen Tool Project. A lot more words. All right, Zen Tool Project Profile. Its responsibility is the loading, parsing, serializing, and storing of a profile file, and it's the topmost node in a resource tree. So, most people are using Zen Framework to create a Zen Framework application. Or if you think of it another way, it's a web project. So, there's a Zen Tool project, which is what we're talking about. These are the pieces inside of Zen Tool project. Zen Tool project extends Zen Tool Framework. We can write a Zen Tool, whatever we want, to extend Zen Tool Framework. Because remember, the framework is handling the dispatching, the request object, the command line interfacing, the metadata, the concept of providers. It's creating the architecture or the harness that this stuff can hang off of. So Zen Tool, when you refer to it, is both collectively the architecture to do tooling, rapid application development, as well as the Zen Tool project, which says I am a specific implementation of the use of Zen Tool. I'm going to be used to manage a project, because 9 out of 10 times that is what everybody's trying to do. So it was the very first providers, or excuse me, the very first tool set that they provided. And we'll get into more about how you can do things other than a project. So Zen Tool project and profile. So if you have a project, you can have a profile. It needs to have a way to keep track of things. And because it's a web application, if you remember back to that diagram where everything was very hierarchical, it's a tree, folders, subfolders, that kind of concept. Zen Tool Project Profile has the ability to manage your project as a resource tree. The profile itself sits at the top of all of that, and then it has just a bunch of children. Am I a controller directory? Am I an action file? Am I a model? Am I this? Am I that? And it has the way to expose all of that to the Zen Tool Framework architecture underneath. Zen Tool Project Profile resource, then, are the individual resources that the profile is keeping track of. Nothing more than that. Basically, it's the customer responsible for the where. It implements a node in the resource tree. It can create new resources at any specified locations. It can find the resources. It contains a Zen project context object. Remember when we talked back before with their manifest, we can provide context. This is how they have that integration. So again, a bunch of stuff, examples, I promise. All right, this is the Zen Tool project context that we just talked about, or just saw in the previous slide. So we had the Zen Tool, let me get my name right. We had the Zen Tool project profile resource, which was more the where. Now the context is the what. And it's going to be assigned to a Zen Tool project profile resource object and different types of context. If you have a piece of code that you want to have executed, you need to know what you're supposed to do with it. Just echo hello, no matter where you put it, is going to run. If you see it visually in your models folder, you're going to think, oh, that's some business logic, or that's a data. If you see it in your view folder, you're going to go, oh, that's my my externally facing view. You interpret that with context based on how it's located, or where it's located, or how it's being used. Same idea here. It's saying, if I've got these resources, I need a context. So anything that you can possibly imagine, you can give a context up to these resources. So again, not too terrible of a concept, although a lot when you first start delving into all of this. Any questions about that? And I said that not truly expecting any, because I can see your eyes.
When you map, let's say you have a server with multiple sites on it. You're essentially, mapping different URLs to different
Correct.
Zen projects.
Yep. Yeah, where we work is exactly that. Because we do registration sites for events, and mine only have a 2-month registration window, and then the site goes down. They're throwaway sites of sorts. We've got 50 or 60 sites running on the same server, and we just all manage them with virtual host entries in Apache. They all have their own root directory, and they're all basically the same Zen Framework application at its core, and then the customization on top of it.
Is this, you're creating a base model project, say a blog, and then is the framework for, or the tooling for adapting that to customize?
You could use it that way. So here's a double-edged sword of Zen Framework. Everything is possible, and everything is possible. You're going to find, and I'll come back to your question, I promise. As you read the manual, it's going to explain something one way. Oh, that's a great example. And then you're going to notice that they switch from using an INI configuration file to an XML configuration file. And you go, well, no, wait a minute. I'm using this one, not that one. I see that example, but I don't know how to convert it to the other one. Like, it's very fluid. They don't have that structure yet. So you can use Zen Tool to do anything you want. You can do exactly what you described. What's the word I want to use? The thinking behind Zen Tool originally, how would people use it the most often, is the idea that you would use it to create an entire application. But what is an application? If you go back to what we talked about, you could have a blog be an application. So you certainly could use it to manage an application, which turns out just to be a module inside of another application. It's a very weird, anybody know MC Escher? You're walking up the stairs, but you're walking down the stairs. Zen Framework kind of has that relationship with itself. And I know, not to pick on Jake, but we've had this conversation before. It's its own worst enemy. It's ridiculously powerful. But how do you start to learn something that powerful? It's very, very hard to start learning it. Zen Tool is great because if you just pull it out, you run it, you get that application structure, and you go, oh, well, I guess that's what it's supposed to start to look like. I'll play from here. And whatever version of Zen Tool you're using, which if you go home and grab the 110 version, you're going to have the latest and greatest example of what a Zen Framework application should look like. Now trust me, from 1.4 to 1.5 changed, 1.5 to 1.6 changed drastically, 1.6 to 1.7 it was pretty drastic again. 1.8, oh, Zen application, forget everything else you'd already learned. 1.9, it stayed pretty common. 1.10, it's becoming more concrete. Zen Framework is only, well, it's officially like 3.5, 4 years old, give or take, kind of, sort of, if you really stretch it. But it really hasn't started to catch on until about 2 years ago. People started to use it right around version 1.04, give or take, a little bit before that. I noticed you had a book. Do you know what version of it refers to in that book, for example? I'm going to guess probably 1.8 or 1.9. So the book you're buying off the shelf is already got you, it's 1.8. So,
1.8.
yeah, so which is not a bad place because it's becoming more locked down. But there have been a lot of changes in Zen Framework as well. So if you tried learning it, let's say 6 months ago, do not let your experiences 6 months ago scare you from trying it today, because it will most likely be a very different experience. Good or bad, we could argue that all night. It just is what it is. Okay, so we talked about Zen Tool Framework and Zen Tool Project, which are the two main classes inside of Zen Tool, and all the stuff that hangs off of it. So let's take all of that information and let's put it together and say, okay, so what exactly does all of those slides mean? What do all of those classes do? How exactly does Zen Tool work? Okay, so we talked about providers. They provide capabilities. By default, Zen Tool Framework is going to look for providers on the include path. It will recursively iterate all include path directories and open all the files that end with the literal text of manifest.php or provider.php. We're going to show examples of that. If you want to write your own Hello World provider, you call it Hello World Provider.php. And Zen Tool Framework, as long as that location of the file is in your include path, Zen Tool Framework will find that provider and expose it as an available resource inside of the Zen Tool Framework architecture. As simple as that. Then, once it finds these, this is just some more of the internal, how does it work? It's going to do an introspection on them and find out, am I really a provider or a manifest? If I call myself a manifest, but I'm extending the provider interface, well, then guess what? I'm really a provider, vice versa. So anyway, it doesn't just take your word for it, take anything. It truly has to have certain capabilities, that it has to expose. Again, Zen Tool Project is consumed by Zen Tool Framework because this is dealing with the idea of creating a Zen Framework application or a Zen Framework website project, whereas Zen Tool Framework is just concerned with, the harness to hang stuff off of. So, again,
Sorry.
oh, sure, no problem.
I'm just trying to wrap my brain around that. Can you say that last part again? The Zen Tool Framework consumes Zen Tool Project because it's a harness.
Zen Tool Framework is going to expose the capability to say, I can talk to the request object, the response object, I can dispatch actions when they come in, I can provide manifest context data. It just says, I provided you a smooth surface, I provided you traffic signals. Now, if you want to build a motorcycle or a bicycle or a truck or a van, I don't care. That's Zen Tool Project. I don't care how you use me, but me is the architecture. I am the roads and the traffic signals.
I just haven't mentally reversed it. Thanks.
Not a problem.
Routing, basically.
Framework can handle that kind of stuff, sure. Yep. So basically, again, in a nutshell, Zen Tool Project only is concerned with project problems. Just like if we create a Zen tool, whatever you want to call it, it's concerned with whatever you want. I mean, this sits on top of Framework. And that then allows the Zen Tool Framework to focus on the problem of knowing which requests are good, knowing how to dispatch your routing. So Zen Tool Framework gets it done. Zen Tool Project says what you want to have done. And I know I'm spinning it several different ways, but certain things will click for different people. So I used to be an instructor, so it's... It took me a month when I first was learning programming to learn a while loop in C. And I would be with a fellow instructor of mine, and I'd be doing it. I'm like, oh, this makes perfect sense. I'd write code examples. This is perfect. I drive to 5 minutes to get home. I spend the next 9 hours beating my head against the desk when I don't freaking get it. I'd go back the next day. We'd go over on the whiteboard. It makes perfect sense. Go home. One day I go, oh, now I get it. And then there's no looking back. It's amazing the mental blocks it can put in place.
I'm just trying to hang it with other MVC frameworks I know of, so I know.
Yeah, not a problem. And Zen Tool Framework will provide the client. Now, of course, it does that with the Zen Tool Framework client, which in this particular case is Zen Tool Client Console. There may eventually be client web, client Twitter, client, whatever. But again, Zen Tool Framework is where that all comes together. So, that is the end of Zen Tool. I promise we'll refer back to it. At the end of each major section, I put these. And again, I recommend strongly you go online to notmessenger.com and download these slides and look through them so you can get this. But these are URLs that will be great to go back and research what it is we just talked about in this section. I'm not going to read these. I'm just merely pointing it out because there's more of these type of slides. So don't get excited. It's not the end of the presentation. Just the end of that section. I wanted, as a person trying to learn this myself at one point, and as you learn other things, you get through a lot of slides, and then you're like, well, man, I wish I knew where I could get more information about that little piece they were talking about. So that's the idea behind this. Okay. So now that we learned everything there is to know about Zen Tool and how it works, let's talk about setting it up to actually begin to use it. This is the fun stuff. You need to install Zen Framework because Zen Tool is part of Zen Framework. You can get a copy of Zen Framework from their website, which is right there. You can get the most recent version, and you can get every single version they've ever released. So it's very nice. You can also check it out from Subversion. You can also get the latest version of Trunk from Subversion. So if you want bleeding edge because you're trying something and you just saw somebody committed something, you want to go give them a try and knock yourself out. As well as you can also get the stable version out of Subversion. If you download and install Zen Server, there's a Zen Server CE, which is the free version, and then there's also a paid version of Zen Server. It's a server stack from Zen that will install PHP, the framework, caching. I know I'm forgetting a few things. as well as debugging and that type of thing. I have not used the latest version of Zen Server. I used it a couple years ago. The latest version that is coming out of beta next week or so, there are hooks inside of the Zen Framework application that you can throw errors that the Zen server can actually capture. So you can see graphs, stack traces. It can notify your development team with paging, all the stuff that Zen server does to manage a server. You can actually throw Zen Framework errors that the Zen server stack will capture, which is some pretty nice stuff. That is not in the CE version. Just tossing that out there. And you can also get it from Pear. Okay, so you need to install it. How do you install Zen Framework? If you went to the website and you downloaded it as a zip file, you unzip it, you're done. Really all there is to it. It is that simple. However, when it comes to how you want to use Zen Framework, it's as individual as each project, your server configuration, each developer, etc. Zen Framework likes to be on the include path by default. You will see a lot of the configuration in the manual talk about being on the include path. So that's great, but then you can't have multiple versions of Zen Framework on the same server, so you need to move the include path management into each individual application. Do you want to put Zen Framework on the server and have your app reference it, or do you want Zen Framework as part of the library of your distributable application? It gets very interesting. The way we do it, and it's just the way we do it, we have multiple versions of Zen Framework installed on our server. In each Zen Framework application, in our library folder, within the application, we have a symbolic link pointing to the version of Zen Framework we want that application to use. So because we have 50 or 60 Zen Framework applications sitting on the same server at any time, and one might have been written 3 months ago, but since then we've went and installed 110, and the latest one we're working on is 110, we still need 1.9 to be there, etc. We have 1.4, 6, all the minors. We've got about 20 versions of Zen Framework. And as old sites are taken down, and we know it's no longer used, then we can delete that, everything's well. That's what works for us. But what gets interesting specific about Zen Tool is you run into a chicken and an egg problem. Zen Tool needs Zen Framework to run. Zen Tool will build you a project. But if you want Zen Framework to be inside of your project, how do you get it there if it has to sit outside so you can have Zen Tool to create it? It's another one of those MCSher things. So you're eventually going to have to say, okay, we have a copy of Zen Tool sitting here to run our stuff, and then you come back around and fill in some of the gaps. So at the moment, it's not as 100% fluid as you'd like. You do have to step around the chicken and the egg concept. But that's about all you can do. For the purpose of this presentation, I installed it in this location. Just so as you see me moving around, that's where I put it. So I have C:/program file/PHP is where my PHP is installed, and I have C:/Zen Framework 1.9.7 is where my library is installed. Again, just for the purpose of this presentation. Okay, so we've installed Zen Framework. We're ready to use Zen Tool. A couple things we have to do first. As always, right? It's never that easy. You unzip, and then you got more stuff you have to do. Okay, we want to be able to use the command line tool, because right now that's the only one that's available, and you're not going to get very far if you don't have a way to interact with Zen Tool. So, there are 2 files in the bin directory of Zen Framework. There's the zf.sh and the zf.bat. These are the operating system specific client wrappers. They are responsible for finding the location of php.exe on your server. Well, in this particular case, that's Windows and obviously the exe. But finding your PHP binary, finding the zf.php file, which is actually the Zen tool, and then passing on those client requests. So when we're talking, if we're on Windows, we're talking to the zf.php file through zfbat. And if you're on Unix, you're doing it through the zf.sh. So these are just operating system specific wrappers. So what is this file responsible for? It handles the understanding of your environment. It's going to know, things that are specific to Windows versus Unix. It's going to take care of building include paths and keeping track of all that stuff. And then it's going to facilitate the routing. So when you type your command, it's then going to take that command and know what to do with it. So zf.php is the gateway to Zen Tool. Everything goes through it. All right. In order to use the command line interface, two things have to be true. These files, again, it's only going to be one at a time, depending on the operating system you're on. They have to be reachable from your system path. That is, that if you go to the command line, no matter which directory you're in, if you type ZF, which is the Zen Framework tooling command, you should be able to access the tool. And Zen Framework library is in your include path. I don't like that. We're going to talk about how you can change that. But these are the two things that have to happen. You have to be able to access ZF, and you got to be able to find the Zen Framework library. So if we know that these two things have to be true, what do we do to get there? The manual will tell you that you should move the ZF files and the ZF PHP into the same directory as your binary, which on Unix is going to be usually in one of these locations, but it could be anywhere. And for Windows, it's usually in one of these locations, but it can be anywhere. Why should we copy these into those locations?
Include that.
Exactly. These are, if your system can find PHP, well then, hey, put these files in there. That's the poor man's implementation right there. Hey, no problem, just throw everything in the Windows folder. I mean, what can go wrong? Just toss it over. The manual, if you go read it, will also talk about, hey, you can also just create a symbolic link in these folders going out. I mean, there's a variety of ways you can solve it. But my recommendation is to get a little fancier with your command line and actually create an alias to these files. So you can leave everything where, I'm a purist. You're going to catch on to that part. I'm a purist. I think things should stay where things are supposed to stay. I don't like the idea of polluting my PHP install with some other files just so I can achieve some functionality. So I like using aliasing. I can alias the ZF command to the actual file that I want. So that way on a command line, when I type ZF, it knows where to go find it. And if I'm on Windows, this is the command I should use. The reason to do that is not only keeping stuff pure. Let's say you're using Zen Tool 1.9. Then 110 came out. Do you want to have to now go and copy the 110 files in to the same location every time a new version comes out, keep things up to date, and remember what was where? And it's just a mess to me to have to stay on top of that, in addition to the pollution. So, you also could modify your actual path if you wanted to on your system. So like in Windows, you can do your path environment variable. Same thing in your in Unix as well. I like alias because, yes, every time I want to do something with Zen Tool, I have to create the alias. Unless I make it as part of my profile when I log in, all that kind of fun stuff. I'm not here to talk about how to manage Unix. But yeah, I have to type this. But I can change my mind in the next console window. I want to point it to a different version. Or I'm going to have it in a different location. I have ultimate flexibility, which as a purist, I love. However, specifically for this presentation, I would run this, and I could alias, and I could call Zen Framework just fine. I type ZF, the commands come up, which you're about to see, and everything was wonderful. Then I tried to pass arguments to the ZF command, and Windows told me to go, screw myself, basically. Because for whatever reason, and I gave up after about an hour, because I don't use Windows, and I just didn't care, I couldn't figure out how to get this to recognize arguments. So I gave up for the purpose of this presentation, and I went and modified my path environment variable, and I added this to my system path on Windows. Because I don't use Windows, and it works in the environment I like. And this gets us to the presentation, and I have the duly noted copy. So much for purity. You'll find I'm also willing to compromise, especially when it's very late. So, that is how we can make ZF available to us from anywhere in our file system. How about adding the Zen Framework library to our include path? Again, I have my own recommendations for this. The manual says you can go find out what your current include path value is, and then you can copy the library over there. The same arguments I made on the other slide apply here. I just don't like it. It makes me feel dirty. If you wanted to do it, again, here's what the manual says. You can come back and read those. I'm not going to bore you with it. Modify your environment. I mean, for Windows, it tells you, modify your environment variable. For Windows, not just what you're trying to do at the moment, but forever and ever, et cetera, et cetera. So, my recommendation, and again, you can take it for what it's worth. My recommendation is to use special environment variables that you can set that the zf.php file will actually read. So now we're getting into some more of the functionality. We can set a variable called Zen Tool include path prepend, which is going to take the path that you provided it, and it's going to prepend it to your already established include path. So it achieves the manual's recommendation of, hey, add this path to your existing path, but it lets you do it with more control. It's not a permanent change. You can change your mind as you go. You can do different things that suit your needs. You can also do Zen Tool include path, which says, I don't care what's on there, completely replace it with what I'm telling you. So pretty self-explanatory, as far as the options go, but that's what it is. How do you do it? I gave you some examples. You can use the set env command inside of the Unix platform. So again, I'm just going to say, hey, I want to prepend. Hey, where am I at? Oh, one thing I didn't mention other than the fact that obviously I work on Unix. I mix some of my examples because as I'm just typing away furiously on slides, this is what comes natural. In this particular presentation, this would be C:/, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously you get the idea. So for the purpose of this conversation, that's not contextually correct, but it's still correct. Oh, hey, look at that. Hey, I would have read my next bullet. Anyway, I just want to get to character. All right, so if you did all of that, and I strongly recommend you pull up my slides on one screen and you walk through all of this on your own. If you went through all of that, you should be able to type ZF at your command line, and you should see a screen like this. Now, there's a lot more, but you should get an error has occurred. The reason for that is we didn't tell it to do anything. ZF by itself as a command is useless, but it's going to throw an error and basically throw out the help and say, hey, this is what you should have called me with. If you can see that, you did everything in the previous slides correctly, and you've turned a humongous corner.
Make that sound so momentous.
I know, right? Woo! Time for a drink. Additional resources. That's the end of that section.